Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Coach Kassem here, and today I am with Dr. Pat Davidson, and we are going to kind of give you guys a preview of an upcoming event that we are having at the end of March, where Dr. Davidson is going to be teaching 2 days of his Rethinking the Big Patterns seminar at the N1 headquarters. So there's never going to be a better time to take that seminar than when you get to come and play on all the N1 toys and all the kit that we have there. But we're going to have a third day after the seminar where we're essentially going to challenge each other's systems, ideas, and whatnot. And I just think it's, such a great, a great opportunity when you can actually get two people together in a physical space to have these discussions rather than the small bits of, conversations and posts and stuff that you see online. So I'm really looking forward to that. So Pat, really quick, why don't you just kind of give people a little bit of background, let you know who you are, and we'll get going.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I guess like the quick hitter background is I have a PhD in exercise physiology, a master's degree in strength and conditioning. I have competed in various sports, like as a kid, baseball, football, and then I got into jujitsu, submission wrestling, mixed martial arts. I competed in that. I fought professionally a couple of times. And then when I got into, like, I was working as a professor after the PhD, and during that time, I got into competing in strongman as well. And during that time, I went to a few national championships and a few world championships. And I think it was 2014, I finished ninth in the world at the 175-pound weight class. Since then, after being a professor, I moved to New York City. I worked in the fitness scene there for 7 years. And I've been kind of done with that for a little bit over a year. And now I really focus on online product sales, teaching seminars, certifications. I've written 3 books. The biggest project I did was the last book that I put together, A Coach's Guide to Optimizing Movement, which is the essentially textbook for my Rethinking the Big Patterns seminar series and certification system. So the Rethinking the Big Patterns stuff is essentially an algorithm. It is an algorithm that helps you determine exercise selection, exercise progression pathways, and it also provides a binary system for saying whether or not people are performing exercises in a competent manner that relies on attempts to standardize the center of mass of the skeleton and to have sensory checkpoints that confirm where the center of mass is.
Okay, so let me see if I can put this in my own words and see if you kind of agree with that, right?
Sure.
So for essentially, you have a system for exercise selection is
Mm-hmm.
kind of like the base component. That's what I'm interpreting when we say we have an algorithm there, right? And then what you've done is you set up standards for technique for the exercises within that system, and you've kind of like
It's I would say that you know I think there's a difference between systems and algorithms take on their own life and make decisions for you rather
mhm.
than making the decision on the fly. Like it's got a internal logic system that guides the decision making process, and then the technique. So I would say that the big thing for me is being able to identify where the center of mass for the person is, and that's the first step for me with constructing an exercise. That's the base of the pyramid. And then I'm essentially superimposing a motor pattern on top of a standardized center of mass. And the motor patterns I have is like, I have resistance motor patterns, athletic motor patterns, and control motor patterns. So for resistance motor patterns, it's hinging, squatting, pushing, pulling. Athletic motor patterns is running, jumping, cutting, and throwing. And control motor patterns are core exercises for the pelvis and the thorax. So you can essentially superimpose any of those motor patterns, which are distinct and have different sorts of like outcome specifics associated with them. That can be put on top of a center of mass that you can kind of account for and have as a standardized point, which I look at it as if you have standardized center of mass for the motor patterns that you're doing, you're increasing the probability that you're going to train the appropriate target tissues that that motor pattern is associated with.
Now, let me see if you agree with this, because, I did do the virtual seminar that I think it was like early pandemic or whatever, right? Like in 2020. I would say that the exercises that you've come up with and you designed, that I'd say what kind of differs in our approaches is you've taken an outside in, approach in terms of exercise design, and we've kind of taken an inside out approach to what we're looking at. I think we probably come together on a lot of things, but the roots of like where our concepts start, yours has been more on the external side, and ours has been very kind of like internal based. Is that something that you would maybe agree with there?
Possibly. I think that for me, maybe I would think mine is almost inside out though, because I almost think of like center of mass is such an interesting topic to me. It's something that like is the summation of where your weight is distributed. Mm-hmm. And I just kind of break it down: sagittal center of mass and frontal plane center of mass for the most part. And sagittal center of mass to me is just forward, backwards, and frontal is lateralization. And I'm just trying to account for those things, because I don't know, to me, like maybe it's my background. I look at it as great athletes and performers are those that control their center of mass. And once they control their center of mass, now they dominate space with their motor pattern performance. Mm-hmm. But if you try to jump to the motor pattern prior to really kind of mastering center of mass, I think you're putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're on the same page there, right? And I think that's one of the things that makes kind of what we do perhaps more complementary than what people want to, will want to think, because you're coming from more of an athletic, more of a planes of motion background, and then we're kind of coming from the exact opposite, but we're trying to get to the same end destination of like, okay, how do we come up with an exercise that loads a tissue the way we want it in the most, beneficial environment for the stimulus, that you're going for. And I think actually, a critique of our own stuff is that, we quickly found that, when we would talk about an exercise being, biased to a particular muscle or whatnot, that was a very popular idea and people loved that. And there was the affirmation where people could do these things and they would, feel that specific area and whatnot. And we could talk about the anatomy and all of this, fancy stuff or whatever. But I think people would latch on to just those specific elements and would forget that those aren't the only exercises that exist in this paradigm. Those are just a certain set of exercises that have a certain set of qualities. And, one of the things I've been, trying to do maybe the last like year and a half is kind of backpedal and remind people like, hey, just because this bias exercise is a new thing that you learned doesn't mean it's the thing that you have to do or they're the only type of exercises to do. We try and find the most accurate way to train an individual tissue to have essentially create like, hey, if you know exactly how this particular tissue functions, then what you can do is you can look at every other exercise that is some sort of adaptation of that and understand what elements of that are then contributing to that in terms of the range of motion and stuff like that, and that's one way of looking at it. And I think the other way is you have these motions, and these positions that you need to be in from an athletic standpoint, from a sports perspective or standpoint, and then reduce down to what actually is producing the force for those things, right? And you're essentially coming to, a similar position. So before we kind of go ahead.
I was just thinking, like you remind, like in the book that I have, the whole model, when I teach the seminars, I just get to the meat and potatoes, but I don't give a lot of the backstory for like where the concepts come from and like what's the foundational thought processes for the model. But I do have these theoretical backbone pieces. And some of them are like variability as a concept. And the one that you reminded me of is the invariant representation concept. And that is essentially like how the brain stores memories. And so motor patterns are just simply expressions of a memory. And I try to illustrate it with the example of signing your name. That's a motor pattern. And you can sign your name with a pen on a piece of paper, but you can also sign your name with your fingertip in the air in front of you. You can sign your name with your nose into the air in front of you. You can sign your name with your toe pointed, your elbow pointed, your knee, whatever. Like the motor pattern is a constant. It just unfolds differently to meet the specific context that you're finding yourself in, which is why you don't have to teach yourself to run up a different hill that's slightly different graded and canted compared to every other hill. It's why like a shortstop doesn't have to practice every iteration of a double play. But the important thing is that you have to have a really strong foundational origin of that memory. And the stronger the original memory for a motor pattern, the greater the ability to express it under different circumstances and to still have the expression register as essentially utilizing the same underlying sequence, coordination, and ultimately recruitment of primary tissues. And so that's why, to me, it's like so important to make the right exercise selection of, hey, what's the first kind of squat we're going to teach? Or what's the first kind of hinge we're going to teach? I oftentimes give the example of like trying to teach a young kid how to shoot a basketball. And I wouldn't want the first shot that I teach them to be a hook shot from 3-point land. It's too complex. It's too, it's all over the place. It's sideways. It's one-handed. You'd want to put them close to the hoop and have them shoot a layup where they're squared up to the hoop. And that increases the probability that they're going to shoot it properly and that they're going to have the outcome that you're looking for. And once they understand those fundamentals, now they can unfold it in different manners. They can ultimately learn how to shoot from further away. They can run, catch the ball, shoot off a pass, shoot off a dribble, shoot with their left hand, their right hand, layup, scoop shot, hook shot, you name it. But the chances that those other iterations are going to be competent is significantly lower if you don't have a good starting place and if you don't have a good progressive sequencing on how to reach some of those more exotic shots. And then the question is, well, do they need all of those shots? If they're 7'2" and they weigh 270 pounds, they probably don't need the same plethora of choices. They don't need as wide a menu of options. So it's all about having an endpoint understanding of how many options need to be available on the menu and how do I get them to the point where they reach their endpoint options in their menu of motor patterns that they're going to express in their training and competition. So that to me is, I wanted to create, like I said, an algorithm that ultimately makes those decisions for you based on general principles. And that is how it's taken me a long time to actually understand the thing that I put together and be able to explain it in a manner that's like an elevator pitch version. But that's kind of,
This is making me think of an analogy that I've kind of been rolling around in my head. I don't know if you're familiar with machine learning at all, but we're in the day where AI is being developed and all this stuff. And when I'm sitting here and thinking about that process, I'm like, this is perhaps maybe one of the best analogies that we could give for this process is walking through the simple example of how, people are teaching machines to learn, where they're essentially saying, hey, we put this thing out here with a set of rules, and then it gets feedback on how it does it utilizing those rules. And, at the beginning, like an example was, I was looking at this guy. He was teaching an AI to run this little, it's like a race car around this like track that he made or whatnot. So it's trying to teach the AI to drive. And essentially, when you're starting this process, you try and give it as few of possible commands that it can run through as possible. So that it just kind of learns what's going on in the world that it's in. And you can essentially change how much the AI is applying what it's learned versus how much it's experimenting new things. And
Mm-hmm.
what happens is, as it starts to learn the fundamentals, you start bringing down the experimentation and using more of what it learns. And so if anybody's kind of, you don't have a background in how the nervous system works or how motor patterns are programmed or all that stuff, go on YouTube and look at how people are using machine learning. And that's essentially, what we're trying to do with these systems, where you're creating a foundation of motor patterns that people can then kind of expand on. And I don't know,
Well,
that may be a useful analogy for your courses. I'm thinking of using it for mine.
what you're talking about is literally where I pulled my concept from. So
No.
it was a of material that I learned from reading books by Jeff Hawkins. And oh my God, I can't believe I'm forgetting the name. It's been a long day, like I said. Ray Dalio. So Hawkins was one of the early pioneers in AI. He's the person that invented the Palm Pilot. And he wrote an incredible neuroscience textbook. He actually self-taught he taught himself neuroscience, and he wrote a
Nice.
book on intelligence, which is one of the best books ever written on the brain and how the human brain and the cortex actually works. And Ray Dalio wrote the book Principles, and Ray Dalio was the founder and main guy for the hedge fund Bridgewater Capital, and that was at one point in time was the most successful hedge fund in the world. And he was the person that began the processes of using, um, algorithms for hedge funds and quants. So I really thought that those were two very influential people on really me developing my thought processes as it pertains to making decisions within exercise selection choice making. And what I like about them is that I think they're both really smart people. And what they say is like, when I'm in the moment and I have to make decisions on the fly, I usually make bad decisions, and if you can ultimately create kind of a master plan that's based on like real principles that have applications that are very broad and far reaching, your chances of having successful outcomes, if you just apply them without emotion, is going to go through the roof. Like that's been a very successful method for playing the stock market, and just winning more over time, and then looking at the results that come back and refining those principles. And like you were talking about with machine learning, just being able to make those adjustments. And so I'm just a big believer in observation and then feedback and calibration based on what's happening with feedback. And if you do that and allow it to have enough reps and data collection, I think that ultimately you can land someplace, so long as you have like kind of a conglomeration of data points all pointing in the same place, where you can really rely on a methodology at a very, very high level, that if you get out of the way at this point as a human with your human brain and limitations, you're probably going to find a tool that can drive much better decisions for you, for everyone you work with, on and on and on.
Mm-hmm. So this is kind of a good segue into the one question I wanted to ask before we get to the come at me section, which is, being a doctor and also having a tremendous background as an athlete yourself. This is always my kind of question for people that are, that love to tinker around in this industry is, what have you actually found to be the more useful background to what you're utilizing today? What's influencing your decision? Does one kind of compound the other? What do you think?
Now, that's a really good question. One of the athletes that I coached years ago, Nick Hadge, he's brothers with Zach Hadge. They're the Hadge brothers on Instagram, and they're both very high level strongman athletes, and just really wonderful guys. And I love them to death. I loved coaching those guys so much and training with them. But I remember Nick at one point in time was like, there's a time to put on your athlete lens for how you look at things, and there's a time to put on your coach's lens for how you look at things. And there's just time and place, time and place, time and place. And I think that's something that a lot of people get wrong. where they're trying to micromanage in the midst of like when you should just be turning off your brain and going into athlete mode. And it's something that Charlie Francis used to say quite a bit as well, the track and field coach, where he was fond of just reminding people, look, sprinting is a hindbrain phenomenon, and the more that you try to bring the forebrain into the moment when someone's sprinting, the worse the result is going to be. So there's a time to think, and that time is not when you're going and doing. Like, if you're doing, you need to really be doing and just going for it and really being as animalistic as you possibly can. So I think that they have complemented each other for me. I'm almost reminded of like Braveheart with William Wallace, where he has that side to him that is intellectual. He can read Latin and recite all of these old verses from Roman scholars and Grecian scholars and all that stuff. But put him on the battlefield and he's going to be a savage. And he doesn't kind of, when you kind of are in the middle there, you're in no man's land. And I think that, it's funny. I think it is a perfect segue because oftentimes some of the points that I'm trying to make, because I think that people that follow you, I think that they get into the weeds in the moment too much, where it's like, look, there's a time and a place to worry about angles and grips and stuff like that. But if you're thinking about it during your set, you're lost. You know what I mean? Like in the set, you should just be, looking for output. Like, the more that you're thinking about, just accomplishing it from a numbers perspective, from an effort perspective, that kind of a thing, perfect. But if you're worried that now all of a sudden, your humorous past your midline or something like that, like, what are you doing? So that's kind of like where I think Nick said it well. Like, there's a time for that coach's lens to be put on. There's a time for the athlete's lens to be put on. And if you don't know the difference, that's kind of the problem.
Mm-hmm. I actually, I totally agree with that. And so the way that we look at with, a more nuanced exercise approach is our whole idea is like setup is the most important thing, right? Is like get your body positioned in a certain way. So then all you got to do is apply force and it should be as thoughtless as possible. So all of your intellectual energy should go into just putting yourself into the right position. And I think you basically have a very similar approach with your system. Is that's essentially what you're trying to do. And then you shouldn't need to be thinking about cues and joint angles and all that stuff once the exercise starts. And I think that's something that is completely lost when people just see emotion online and, when somebody's like, oh, it looks like that. And, oh, how do I make it look like that? And I think that's where there's it's a big challenge to live in a space where we do right now, where the best ways to promote our business and get our informations out there are platforms that have that punish nuance essentially, right? And we're peddling in nuance. That's essentially what we're doing, right? And that to me is the constant hurdle of trying to get our information out there. Sometimes I'll be like, well, I just don't want to post anything because I know that it's just not going to, like, on this medium, it's not going to be the actual message. And I know that it's going to get copied and regurgitated and, it's going to get spit out a mile away and it's going to be nothing like what I did originally or what I intended it, for it to be. I'm guessing you're not on TikTok, right?
I'm not, and I'm not even
Yeah.
on my Instagram either.
Yeah.
Like I answer messages that people send, but I have somebody run that for me because I just really don't like the experience of being on social. It's so I try to live in my own bubble that's outside of it, quite honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I made it about a month on TikTok, but the irony is that we have like several like million tags on TikTok, and that's the whole reason me going over there is like, oh, okay, people over here using it, and it turns out that there's like a handful of people that were just copying our stuff and putting it on there, and that's where a bunch of the stuff was coming on. And so I'm looking at that and I'm like, oh man, like this is being associated with us, but it's not us, right? And it's these guys now, like one of the guys has, like several million followers, right? And so it's like, wow. And so it's one of those situations where I'm like, am I a net positive in this world? If this is down the road, the end product, right? And then boy, that'll fuck with you mentally.
Funny how it seems like the co-writers, I think it's because they can, in some ways, their verbiage, the way that they'll speak to people might connect a little bit more with more people.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, you being the actual creator, you're probably on a level of intelligence that's actually making it hard for you to communicate sometimes with gigantic swaths of people. You know what I mean? There is like a point at which, I mean, there's enough research showing like if you have too much of a gap in IQ, then you literally can't even really communicate in a meaningful way. And I think it's like 20 points or something like that.
Yeah, it's not a lot.
You kind of need you need other people that basically just copy your shit and get famous, like because they're a couple notches down from you, and they run with it. But it's tough because it's almost like, I don't know, I hate seeing when, like, the fact that you've created something and other people get famous off of your shit kind of bothers me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then when I think about the ways in which they butcher it or like misconstrue stuff, it's like most of the time, I'll be honest with you, like when I'm kind of throwing shade, it's not really at you. It's more people that kind of like plagiarize you and do a bad job of it.
Yeah, I know, but most people don't know, right?
Right.
So, which,
Because, it creates more interest in some ways.
yeah. I mean, to be honest, I have seen probably the best growth in our business when people have, tried to criticize and take stock. Because honestly, that's when people are emotionally invested enough to actually pay attention to the details and the nuance, is when there's some drama and when there's some turmoil. When it's not, good luck getting people to read a caption or whatnot. But as soon as there's a little bit of like emotional investment on these people's minds, they will watch every video, they will read every comment, every caption, they will be totally invested. And so I find that has oddly actually been one of the best things for us, right? As much as, I don't mind debating, but I don't like bickering. I actually love debating, but like I hate bickering because I'd look at every conversation as like, this is an opportunity for me to either, enhance my point of view or learn something new. Like that's the worst case scenario is I learn something new if I'm wrong. And the best case scenario is I get better at solidifying my viewpoint at that
Right.
point in time. Right.
The
So the
other
other, go ahead.
remind me of is the only time anybody cares about politics is when there's negative politics. It's the only time, you know what I mean? It's why
Yeah.
Trump was so, like the Trump Clinton, politics stuff. People watch that stuff. You know what I mean? Nobody cares if two people. It's just look like we as a species have a negativity bias. The leading theory as to how we developed language is that it was originally utilized as a way to gossip about other people in your tribe. That's
Yeah.
the leading theory that scientists have come up with. So it's just interesting. Like that is where we're wired. And the reason that we do that is because it's so hard to make your mind up about anything that's complicated. And you're looking for convergence of viewpoints to confirm whether or not you're right about something. That's the only way that you can ever kind of move towards knowing what the truth is convergence of confirmation, basically. And so we're so in need of that it's kind of like we kind of put things out there as feelers. I don't really like this. What do you think? I don't really like it either. And then you get into this echo chamber thing, which is unhealthy. I really do try. I like throwing grenades into the world and watching what happens in the aftermath. But I also really try not to stay inside my own bubble and drink my own Kool-Aid for too long, because there is no one correct answer ever. You know, I really fundamentally believe in the power of opposition, and how as soon as you think you know what the answer is, I guarantee you that the opposite is probably also the answer too. As much as you have a hard time believing that the opposite is also true, but the nature of complex phenomena is that there is always more than one correct answer for how to get to an endpoint. And the ability of people to accept that is limited, and it's just kind of the way that our brains are wired to crave simplicity.
Yeah, people want the simplest story possible, right? And I see that you're one of the only other people I know that puts out stuff as like a social experiment, or just for a reaction. Like, I'm going to post this just to kind of see what happens. You probably, I would say you would do it. You do it more than I do, right?
But I do believe the things that I say, though. I don't just say things that I don't believe. I actually think about things, and I say to myself, like, do I really think this? Yeah, I do. Like, how can I word this so I'm really being true to myself, but like knowing that it's kind of like this will definitely be a problem on some level, you know, but fuck it. Let's just throw it out there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I'm never inauthentic with anything that I say. You know, it's just that I also believe a lot of things. And just because I say one thing doesn't mean I can't believe something else. That I don't think that being contradictory is actually as bad as what people think. I really don't. Because again, I think that there's multiple angles that reach the truth, you know? But every time that I try to express an angle, I do it in a way that I really believe is my authentic view on something.
I think that's, being able to go away from the status quo and, just constantly be challenging stuff. I would say that's one of the luxuries that I've had. Not, I didn't decide that I was going to try and go compete in anything, or whatever. I was just like, okay, I like to train because I like to train, and I love to problem solve. And this happens to be the area that I found that I enjoy the problem solving process. And so the majority of my training career has not been for any specific goal other than just fucking around and find out. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that has, positioned me a little bit differently, in that, like, I am able to pivot more than people that are spent a lot of time investing into oh, it's this way. I did it this way for this long, I got this result or whatever. It must, like, I've gotten to the point where I'm not attached to anything, but I can simultaneously, like, my colleague Joey that works with me, he's a little bit more of a pessimist with things. Whereas I, like, as we're going through this process, I tend to get really confident when I think when we're onto something. He's like, how can you be so confident? And I'm like, I'm just constantly thinking about this or whatever. And all of the information is pulling me this way. Right. And I'm perfectly confident that if everything is telling me this is the way it's going to go, that I'm going to go with that. I'm not going to be hesitant. I'm going to jump in and see what happens. And if it's wrong, I'm not going to be afraid to, like, oh, well, I didn't work. I'll go over here and try it this way or whatever. Right. Where I think so many people are so afraid to ever do anything wrong or deviate from the path and get any criticism that, they just end up in this kind of repetitive cycle. And to me, it's intellectually boring and stagnant. So,
yeah, look, like I have lost in life so many times in so many different ways. I've made so many errors. I've screwed up. You know what I mean? Like, I've literally, like, imploded my own life multiple times and had to, like, start over in different ways, like different careers, different everything. And every time I've done that, it's ended up being the best learning I've ever done. Like, I always felt like when I was in school and I raised my hand and I confidently answered something and got it wrong, I never forgot that. You know, it was always painful, but it was always this, avenue into much better learning that really stuck with me. So I look, like, I am outspoken. I actually, I think I'm pretty smart. I'm lazy, to tell you the truth, but when I actually put myself to work and actually do things. Like I can problem solve on a high level, but I fear my own laziness. And
Mm-hmm.
I know the motivators that I have to not be lazy. And it's mostly like not to look stupid in front of other smart people. And when I am threatened with that, I'll typically work hard to learn things so that I don't look like an idiot
Yeah.
and that I speak confidently and kind of have a good thing. But it's almost like I've kind of learned the strategy of like, I'm going to paint myself into a corner and be forced to have to figure it out and come out swinging. And it's always worked for me. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like maybe it's not the best strategy in life. It hasn't landed me that many friends, but it's been effective for making my life pretty interesting. But also like I think just learning that there's lots of ways to do things. You know, there are a lot of ways to do things. I love finding the what I think are the common denominator and threads that really uh, overlap and give you like consistency of knowing that hey, I really found like a major load bearing structure here that I can go back to over and over again. This is like old faithful here, but you know, I'm very certain that I will put my foot in my mouth a million more times in my life. But because I'll put my foot in my mouth, I'll grow from the experience. And I think that when people are afraid to look stupid and do nothing, they stay the same. You know, I think if I've learned anything about evolution, it's that nothing changes unless it's forced to change. And it takes tremendous discomfort to force anything to change. You know, for humans to deviate from the last common ancestor with chimpanzee, it took the drying of the African continent and the creation of the Rift Valley with volcanic activity that caused like 2/3 of the rainforest land in Africa to recede and basically built out desert and savanna. And so, like, all the calories were gone. You had to leave the jungle and you had to try to, you know, locomote 3 times more than you ever did. You had to hunt rather than just pick things off the tree. And that level of stress led to this tremendous anatomical divergence from other primates. So if you live too comfortably, nothing changes. If you don't
Mm-hmm.
put yourself out there, nothing changes. And it's very easy to not change. You know, like it really is. Like, but I think that I'm just an itchy person, you know, like I crave imbalance so that things happen and move. And it kind of gives me a sense of purpose.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of not being afraid to be wrong and being itchy,
I love it.
so those of you guys that are interested in coming to this event, a lot of basically what's going to happen on day 3 is us not being afraid to be wrong and challenging ourselves. So as a preview for that, because I feel like I'm getting a little bit of an unfair advantage having, actually seen your course virtually, and then you're going to, come and do it at our headquarters or whatnot ahead of time. Is I wanted to open the floor to you, give people a little bit of flavor or whatever. It's like, hey, whatever criticisms or critiques or whatever you want to, the personal hate, whatever, go ahead, come at me, bro, whatever you got.
Well, I think the easy one is, I think about all of the great, because your thing is hypertrophy, right?
I
So
mean, that's how people, I think that is the most popular use of it. That's
okay,
fair. But
okay,
it is not necessarily a hypertrophy model.
all right. Well, I guess that I think that when people think about your stuff, they think about it as a hypertrophy model. That you're essentially, if they do your exercises, then they're giving themselves the best chance at hypertrophy. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's how a lot of people would view it. You know, how do you explain all of the great bodybuilders that do exercises that don't look anything like the things that, you've come up with, that have grown themselves to that level of mass?
Well, this is always the fun question.
Right?
How do you explain the conclusion of a thing of compounding variables on top of compounding variables and whatnot?
I can get
I mean,
more. Is exercise selection and execution ever the rate limiting variable for how much meat someone's going to grow on their frame?
Well, it has to absolutely be possible, because there's no amount of leg extensions that you're going to do that are going to give you 20-inch biceps. Right. So there's a certain threshold of an exercise that you need. Right. Now, what you can argue is that once you meet that threshold, how much of a diminishing return is there, right? And then what are the grounds that we're equating this on? Like, okay, you got two different exercises, right? And like, are we going to put the same volume and the same effort and all of those things? Because that's just not a realistic thing when you look at a lot of exercises. I mean, there's some exercises that beat you up more. There's some exercises that are easier to take to failure. There's some exercises where you can get better recruitment. So essentially, I think the main reason that people look at this, what we do is like, oh, these are good exercises for hypertrophy, is essentially what we've done is we've said, hey, when you're performing this exercise, what we've done is we've found the exercise where you can be sure that this specific tissue is going to be the limiter. So that means like when the goose is cooked in this exercise, when you've taken it to the degree of failure that you want, when you've put in all of the effort, the sets or whatnot, that the majority of that focus went into this. So it's not so much that you can't grow muscles doing other things. It's more so about an assurance that this exercise is targeting this specific tissue. Because when we're doing, we'll say, exercises that are not biased exercises, they're exercises where we recruit multiple things. You look at a squat, you look at a pull-up, you look at a barbell, but like there can be a variety of limiters in there for different people with different structures and stuff like that. And there's nothing wrong with utilizing those exercises, especially when your goal is to try and get a stimulus in a bunch of different tissue at once, right? What has attracted people to what we're doing is we're saying, hey, for the person that's struggling for this or has this specific goal, we can now unpack the nuance of how you could be assured that you're actually getting that training stimulus where you want it, right? So the whole pun of like, oh, you don't need to do an iliac lat pull down, you can just do fucking chin-ups or whatever. And I'm like, well, if your goal was to guarantee that you were putting that stimulus in the iliac lat for whatever reason that you wanted to do that, whether it be because you're training the other parts of the lat the other day, or that's the part that you need to bring up to be on, on stage or whatever, you just like the nerdy sound of it. I don't care. The truth is that if anybody just jumps up and does a pull-up, there's no guarantee that their iliac lat is actually going to be the limiter. So that means of the amount of stimulus that it could get before you fatigue in that exercise, it might not be there. That doesn't mean that it couldn't possibly be there, but that just means that this is the situation where if you had a very specific goal, how could we set you up for the highest amount of success to meet that specific goal? The error I think a lot of people make is assuming that the goal is always that specific.
Yeah. So that's where my next question there is, who does that apply to then? Does that literally only apply to the most elite of the elite? Like I think that a lot of people who basically have the muscle mass of like Betty White or a prepubescent kid are doing all these very specific drills, and they're actually they're using the wrong tool for their job, because they actually need bigger motor unit recruitment global drills because they're so underdeveloped. Like that's like, so do you know where I'm going with this? Like, is it really only an appropriate tool for the most advanced, and is it a poor choice for people that are actually maybe intermediate level at best lifters?
So there's different ways to look at this. And I can argue both sides of this actually, quite well, I think, right? In terms of like, should people at the beginning of their training career focused on exercises that are training more muscles at once? Should they use more compound exercises? Should they use more large motor patterns or whatnot? Or other things. So I think that you have different approaches. And the thing with like looking at being able to like break things apart is you have to figure out what limitations does this person have? How hard can I push them? How much volume and fatigue, can they tolerate? So one of the things about being able to use more bias and more specific exercises is it allows you to all of a sudden have more creativity in your program design. So that means like, oh, you're training X amount of days a week or whatever. And when you're building a program for somebody, you're trying to figure out how can I put pieces in here, like in the days that I have, the amount of time I have each day that's going to fit their maximum output and not exceed what they can recover from and whatnot, that's going to lead us to our goal. The problem you have when you only have, big rocks to smash into those spaces is that you end up with gaps in between those rocks, right? So one implementation is like, well, why not both? Why can't you use big exercises and, small exercises that maybe, because maybe you got a person that's their foundational, but they do have some specific physique goals that there's no reason that you can't start early in their career. I mean, because if these exercises are going to be the ones that they're going to use later on, why not, if you have the capacity, why not start actually improving those motor patterns now? Why not start biasing that stimulus now so that, you're already working towards that goal? The other option is, you look at, let's just make this a very simple example, like elbow flexors. Okay. We have multiple elbow flexors. If you go ham on a set of easy bar curls or whatever it is, right, we'll call that an omni exercise, meaning that the majority of the elbow flexors are going to be working relatively similarly. Like it's not biased at any particular head of the bicep or brachialis, brachioradialis, etc. So when you do that, then, a couple days later, if you wanted to train elbow flexion again, you're kind of limited in terms of what is recovered. But if I can be a little bit more precise with my exercise selection, I can be like, well, I can choose an exercise over here that's going to bias, say it's going to be the short elbow flexor, say it's going to be the brachialis or whatever, a little bit more. The biceps are still going to get some stimulus, but not as much so that they're not as fatigued. So then on the other day, I can actually train them with a little bit more. And so it allows me to organize things so that I can actually start fitting more stuff like in a person's program. So from a hypertrophy perspective, volume being one of the things, like volume of mechanical tension being the thing we're trying to, like, as much of that over time that we can recover from, that's the thing that's going to give us growth. That's, the most important thing. It doesn't mean that the metabolites and other stuff don't, come into a play, but it's really the main driver is going to be volume of mechanical tension, maybe mechanical stretching as well. So if I can find these ways that I can get more of that stimulus within a person's recovery capacity, then I can get more results over time. Now that may not be efficient in time, because if I just do like a bent row where I can hit my erectors and some of my lats, my rhomboids and my rear delts and my elbow, like all at the same time, that's a big bang for your buck, right? But a lot of exercises like that then kind of leave you at a cap for the volume that you can do, unless you start fitting in any other exercises that somehow you have, the capacity to do that aren't fatigued. The other aspect of this is, in general, and I don't put this out as like, hey, this is, a fear mongering thing or whatever, but in general, biased exercises are more orthopedically friendly, right? Not saying like if you do big movements or whatever, it's bad for your joints, but it's just simple. There's a little bit more strain when we're talking about thousands of reps over years and stuff like that. So a huge appeal, like you'll see like guys like Alberto Nunez and stuff like some of these like more seasoned athletes, they find these exercises and they almost have like a resurgence in the amount of training and the volume that they can do, because orthopedically and from an inflammatory and like stress perspective, the amount of volume they can tolerate all of a sudden improves. Right. So
I guess,
I don't know if I answered your question all, because it's a huge roundabout, but
yeah,
go ahead.
it is, a couple of things. I think there's so many ways that I could go here. I'm going to stick with the first one that came to mind, which is just like the logistics of program design. I think it's all constraints. You know what I mean? Like program design is just coloring in between the constraint lines. And so when I think about, the number of sets per week that are appropriate for stimulating enough muscle growth, I think we have kind of a consensus view that it's sort of like somewhere between 8 and 24, muscle group dependent, individual dependent, nutrient level dependent, a lot of things, but 8 to 24 is a reasonable number. And, essentially, if I'm looking at and then I have the workout itself. And in a workout, I'm probably going to have multiple muscle groups that I'm going to be training at the same time. And a per workout set number seems to generally have a cap around 25 sets of hard exercises in a training session. So if I have something like, back, biceps, shoulders in a training day, I have 25 total sets at tops to play with. It's probably going to be somewhere between 10 and 25 sets per training session. And so, I have my back exercises. I might have two back exercises that I'll get my, sets in for back in this day. I'll have maybe two bicep exercises and maybe two shoulder exercises. So if I'm just dividing up between those things, I have 6 exercises and I have to get 25 sets between those 6 exercises. It's just kind of like, well, your choices become like, if I have 2 back exercises, I probably have a vertical pull and a horizontal pull of some kind, you know? And so I kind of need a big enough bang for my buck out of each of those choices. If I only have 2, if I'm doing biceps, I need a big enough bang out of those things. It's just where I'm painting this is like, how many times are you going to train those across the week? Like 2-3 times a week, probably at most for these groups. And I'll have 2 exercises for back on Wednesday, and then maybe I have 2 other exercises for back on Saturday. We're talking 4 total different exercises that I accumulate all my sets with. I guess and it's like you try to fit all these things together. It gets harder and harder and harder the more you're trying to fit these things in. So it's like, where does the, for like, and if I'm training someone that's an intermediate, it's like, all right, I got a lat pull down of some kind and some kind of a row, on each day, or a pull up and a row of some kind, chest supported row, a dumbbell row, a bent row. I'm almost reminded of like my mixed martial arts coach. He was like, there's only so many ways you can break somebody's arm. You fit your hips into their shoulder socket. You can do it from the guard, from the mount, from the half guard, from the side mount. You can do a flying one, but ultimately it's just like you got to fit the 2 sockets together, and then you extend the arm, bang, there it goes. And so I'm just thinking along similar lines of like, who does that apply to it at a certain point? Like, I can definitely see like a very seasoned elite bodybuilder that's like, yeah, my elbows hurt, my knees hurt, my hips hurt, my neck hurts. And you're like, okay, well, I found like the 3 exercises you can do that don't bother you. But for everybody else, I'm just thinking like they kind of need like a big raw stimulus to be able to drive these responses, and like fitting it in is the logistical hardship, in my opinion. And so,
Okay.
like, I guess I'm just painting it. I'm more describing it. You can run with the thoughts that I'm giving.
So when you look at the biased exercise, where it's like this is the most specific thing that you could do for a very specific tissue, if we put that on one end of a continuum, the opposite of that continuum is, why not just do one exercise that covers everything, right? Why do 2 back movements? Why do a horizontal vertical pull, right? Why not just do a pull, right?
I mean, mostly just you're biasing kind of lats with one and mid back with the other.
Oh, you're biasing.
The
I
usual,
see what you did there.
yeah.
So that's
Well, you
the
don't.
thing, right? Is how do you know the one's biasing lats and the other one's biasing upper back or whatever, right? How do
Yeah.
you know how close you are to the target? You have to know where the target is to know how close you are to the target, right? And so a misconception is that because we teach what a shortened clavicular pec is, that the only exercise that we would do for the clavicular pec is that, right? That's the common misconception of when people look at our stuff for class. It's like, no, but understanding what a shortened and a lengthened position of the clavicular pec is and understanding its mechanics lets you know, well, if I'm doing some sort of an incline press today, how well is that targeting that versus how well is it targeting the delt versus how much is it sternal pec? So then if I am going to have a second exercise, I can say like, well, do I want something closer to that because I'm not getting that well? Or do I want something very different than that because that's already good and I want something for the lower? Just like, okay, if I'm doing 2 pull exercises, do I want, how different do I want them to be? And what element do I want them to be? Is it just that one's pulling from up and one's pulling here? Or do I want the arm path to slightly differ, right? And if you're doing 2 days, well, now realistically, we have 4 exercises. So that's a lot to work with, right? And you're not going to do the same program for the rest of your life. So based off of the results that you got on this exercise, right? If you say, hey, this is what happened when I did that, I'd like to see a little bit more of that. What does that exercise look at in comparison to this? How do I move towards the target of what I wasn't getting in this last program, right? In this last program, I was focused on XYZ, body part or this movement. How can I make that movement give me more of this thing that I wasn't getting out of it that I want to? So it allows you to troubleshoot within your programming, within a workout, within your program, and also from mesocycle to mesocycle, right? Because like, hey, well, if I want more of this, then I'm going to do more of this type of row. So just because these biased exercises exist doesn't mean they have to be there, but you could also look at this complementary kind of thing you have going where you're doing a big exercise, but that big exercise, there's going to be a weakest, part of that exercise, right? So if you're doing, if you're like, let's say you're not a very good quad squatter, right? But you like squats are still good. They're going to be some quads, even if you have the longest femurs in the world, they're still going to be like, some quads, right? Of course, we could just get into the technique things of all things people could do, but let's just assume that, whatever, right? You're limited on something. You could take something that's like, hey, this covers 9 out of 10 things. So what's the appropriate thing to add to the program? The thing that does the one thing that one doesn't do, right? Well, how do you know that? Well, you have to be able to figure out like, okay, if this is that element that's missing, this is the perfect exercise that comes in it. And let me ask you this, because this is one of the questions I say. So people look at these biased exercises and they're just like, oh, well, if you do those, you're only getting like this thing and you're not getting all the stuff that you're getting in this other thing. And I'm like, you're kind of making my argument for me. By you saying that I'm missing out all these things because they're very specific at this, I'm saying, well, these exercises are then doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And that's how you would use that tool, right?
I guess that I look at it like, if you take a big compound movement and the person does it through a partial range of motion, they're really biasing certain motor units that participate in that degree of excursion, and they're failing to train the full plethora of motor units. Just simply by ensuring that someone is doing an exercise through full range means that I have to do less total exercises because I'm going to be providing a stimulus to more total motor units. And, from what seems to be emerging is that if we allow the exercise to feature really putting an emphasis on the length and position of the muscle we're going for, then it seems to be driving a significantly greater, mechanical response that leads to a hypertrophy process with that tissue. Okay. The review paper that's out there at this point, just kind of showing, I don't know what the units of measure are, but for length and position exercises, I believe it was an effect of 0.86 at the low end up to 1.83 at the high end. And for short position exercises, it was 0.08 up to 0.81. I believe that was the numbers that they were reporting off of 11 papers. So in the best case scenario, a short partial range of motion exercise is still worse from a hypertrophy stimulus standpoint than the worst lengthened position partial range of motion exercise. So, what I'm looking at, my overall views on this. Number one, like, lengthened position means that you're going into an uncomfortable full range for the most part on most of the exercises that you're doing. The place where people don't like to go, the bottom of a squat, a horizontal press where you really get deep for the end point of that exercise. It's the part that nobody wants to do. And then, you have to be able to progressively overload. And at a certain point, progressive overload just becomes incredibly uncomfortable. And you have to progressively overload your food over time. It's all of the things that are just kind of like uncomfortable things, you know? And I just think that if I had to like bet my money on what's going to drive growth, it's fewer exercises done with more range, with more load over time, with more food over time, as opposed to like a greater total number of exercise choices that people are doing. Because I feel like you have to delimit your choices down so you can master them so that you can progressively overload them to a greater degree.
Okay. How much time do you have just before I respond here?
I got time, you know.
Okay. So let me pull apart that work in. So one is, let's look at the correlation with things that are difficult and length and position. I agree. Bottom of squat, hardest part. Bottom of a press, hardest part. But is it because that's where the stretch is, right? I mean, a stretch can be uncomfortable, but those are also uncomfortable because that's actually where the mechanical loading is the greatest. Nobody avoids the top of a pull down or the bottom of a pull up, right? Like, and that is the most stretched position.
Short change pull ups all the time. Very rarely do they like lock out their arms.
If anything, I would say I see the opposite. Is most people have a harder time getting fully shortened than they do getting a fully stretched. I would say that is the bias that I see. What'd you say?
A lot of times I think people can't get up there in the first place. But I think that people that I've seen plenty of people do those terrible short pull ups where they never go down and straighten their arms. Mm-hmm. I think people that are really weak that can't do a pull up do kind of partials at the bottom, but that's just because they literally can't get to the top. Mm-hmm. But people that can do the top avoid the bottom with vertical.
So I would say that more people avoid the hard part of exercises, especially with tempo. They bounce out of things and whatever, than they necessarily avoid it. They avoid a stretch. Now, there is a certain neurological thing that goes on where the effort kind of goes up when we're kind of under a stretch, like the mental effort, right? You know, because there's an increased coordination during an eccentric and when the muscle is stretched. So there is just this like people are going to feel perceptively that those things are more difficult, right? And I don't disagree that right now all the data we have suggests that lengthened positions are superior on a set by set basis for hypertrophy, right? Not 100% of the stuff, but a majority of it. Like there's a couple of exceptions. Like there's a tricep study that found like, you know, only coming down halfway or whatever. Right? So there's a few, like, so it's not like this whole like, man, we just have this pile of research that it's absolutely here. I think that definitely is the trend, and I think that's where you should put your money. That being said, in these exercises that do a bunch of things, you can't get everything to a full stretch. Like, so the lats, like you can't just stretch all, like when you're overhead, right? The lats that are high, like they get stretched horizontally. They don't get stretched. So if we're looking at, okay, how could I maximize stretch mediated hypertrophy? These biased exercises afford you to put that stretch on more tissue if you implement them than if you just implement a few big exercises, right? And so that's one of the reasons that, like, well, you may need to kind of rotate what you're doing. Like if you're only doing horizontal rows with your arm never crosses the other one, like they're just all these handles that are in front of your body, even if they're the narrowest like V handle in the world, you're not getting the same amount of stretch that you could if you could bring your arm across your body. So if you wanted to go after stretch mediated hypertrophy, if that was the thing that you thought, man, this is the golden ticket to hypertrophy, you would actually lean more towards using these bias exercises, because you can get, in almost all the time, right? Not all the time, but most of the time, you can get a greater stretch in anything, but also it gives you the ability to get stretch in different divisions that would otherwise you just wouldn't hit with a lot of these, more compound or big movements, right? So, I mean, you can get to a certain degree of hip flexion in a squat, but to fully lengthen the glute, you have to orientate the femur in a way that you can't be standing on your feet, right? Like, because it has to like come across the body. Like there's no way you're going to do that in a leg press or something like that. It's like when you look at gait, like when the transition when somebody's finishing hip flexion and gait, right? There's that little shift or whatnot. Like that's like the tibia is just kind of angled in, right? That little swing that's the lengthened glute is continuing in that direction, not continuing in just this straight sagittal plane. So I look at something like lengthened hypertrophy as a really good reason to incorporate some of these exercises, right? And again, I'm not saying that these are the only way. Like, I don't think that like this is the only way to do it. Like, if you were to look at my training, you know, I do dumbbell presses, just, you know, whatever. But I also do cable motions, right? Like for the things that I want to be more specific, right? I'll do, you know, a press or whatnot, you know, I'll do pull-ups, I'll do squats and lunges and split squats and all of those things, but I'll also do pendulum squats and leg extensions and specific, you know, abduction motions for like the glute medius or whatever, right? And I'll periodize those in where I think it's important to bring that up like as desired. So like when I'm writing a program for somebody and they have a specific aesthetic goal, that might be like, hey, I'm going to put more of these type of exercises here and really try and take advantage of the stretch mediated hypertrophy and the fact that I can divvy it up and maybe get a little bit more volume. But the areas that aren't a priority, I'm going to use these kind of one size fits all exercises where it's like, hey, you're going to get a big bang for your buck here. So we're not going to have to spend a bunch of time on all these other, you know, muscles that aren't as much of a priority for you, but we're going to get a good stimulus there. It's going to contribute to your body composition. You know, it's going to maintain the muscles there. Maybe you grow it just at a slower rate, but I'm going to partition that volume. So if the logistical problem is just, I don't have time or, you know, the ability to learn this many exercises or whatever, well, then you just got to choose your battles and you say like, well, I'm going to put more specific exercises where I have more specific goals. And I'm going to put more general exercises where I have more general goals. But I'm not just going to be like, okay, I'm just going to use just the general exercises and hope for the best, because these on a 1-to-1 ratio give me the most whole body hypertrophy, right? Because eventually, I mean, you talk about like, look at all these guys that built all these physiques, right? Name one bodybuilder from the 80s or whatever that didn't have a body part that they fucking bitched about or they were insecure about or whatever, right? You know, and what they would do is that then when they would hunt and try and find these exercises that all of a sudden would click for that body part, or they'd find the secret program or rep scheme or whatever it is, right? And essentially, like, all I'm trying to do is unlock those tools so that when that goal's there, great, right? If you want to use this as an efficiency tool for the way that it fits in your programming, great. You know, there's so many ways that you can use a tool once you know it exists, right? But just because it exists doesn't mean you have to use it or you should use it. So if I'm kind of not repeating myself too much here, I think there's a time and place for both of these things. But I think that I can think of just as many instances of like where I could find a way to utilize these exercises, even in a beginner, right? So it's not like, well, these exercises are only for these people. It's just that when you're using for them for a beginner, it might be for a very different reason, right?
It's when you're it's like the way I look at Olympic lifts with young athletes. It's like we're not making bank off of this right now, but if you learn to do this in the future, when you've gotten strong enough to where this is actually a reasonable choice, you know how to do it. You know, I guess that it, like, so, okay, I'm going to go with this. I think I'm going to leave it because I think we could probably talk about this stuff all night, and we're going to have plenty of time in the seminar to be able to go into this. But I am going to come at you with a very specific question, which is, do you think that the CAS glute bridge is a good exercise to grow glutes?
So in terms of like absolute hypertrophy, no. Like, and I tell people this all the time, like, look, that exercise is popular not because I posted a lot. Like, I mean, you've never even probably seen me do it, right? Like, you know, you're gonna have to really fucking, you know, get on me to do some sort of like, you know, put a bar on the ground and do all this other shit. I have all this fancy equipment, so I don't have to do shit like that. But honestly, no, like, one, it's a short position exercise, right?
Yep.
So but that's what its purpose is for, right? So the way that I utilized that when I was training, you know, a lot of bikini competitors was there are certain exercises, and I think this is kind of what, you know, Brett Contreras kind of like stumbled upon, was that, hey, there's these people that want to grow this area and really limit growth in these other areas. So what the CAS glute bridge is it's very specific, right? Meaning that you can do those all day. You're not going to grow a lot of quads and adductors and whatever, right? Is the glute growth going to be as good if you were doing, you know, some lunges and some split squats and leg presses and it's all these lengthened exercises that have more range of motion, etc.? No, but it does have the benefit of being very specific to that tissue. So I look at something like that as like, hey, this is something that we sprinkle on top to make sure that goose is cooked. So like I would, when I was working with all those competitors, what I would do is I would use exercises like that as like pre or post exhaust with like squats and leg press and lunges and things like that, or finishers it was a way for me to like put in volume that wasn't really going to contribute to a lot of fatigue, but that volume was very, very specific to that one thing that they wanted to do. And when you're in the body composition world, or even in the bikini world, or whatever, working with competitors, etc., I think like the short position exercises are not one-to-one as good for hypertrophy as lengthened exercises. I'm pretty sure that we're not ever going to change our mind on that. But what we also know, like, is that short position exercises have much less fatigue. So comparing them on a set-to-set basis, that goose is cooked, but that may not be the whole story, right? And so when we're working on body composition goals with people, we may actually intentionally use exercises like that where we can expend a lot of energy with very little fatigue, because then actually like it's almost like we're intentionally trying to be inefficient, meaning that we're going to have to use more set and rep volume, but it's because we want more of the metabolic stimulus and more of the metabolites to come along with that training when the goal is just shredding off body fat. And the other thing is those exercises tend to be very good at like getting a pump and creating like a little bit of nutrient partitioning or whatever. So like if somebody's going through a transformation and the first thing they do is they start going through their diet and all their muscles, like, just kind of like go flat and deflate or whatever. Sometimes like from a psychological standpoint as a coach, it's like, hey, if I put in these things that makes people feel like they really work that area that they're working on, there's a psychological benefit for that. Or if it gives them a pump there that I know this isn't going to be as good for hypertrophy as, these, back foot elevated split squats that we did. But what that's going to happen is this is going to give them that psychological boost to push harder, to drive harder, to stay compliant, to stay committed and whatever. And they're going to have a little bit more of a booty pump now between now and the next exercise. So I don't think if you look at a one-to-one cast glute bridge, poor exercise selection for hypertrophy if you're weighing it on that scale. But as a way of saying, hey, I only want glutes, like can't afford another ounce of adductor or quad. Judges said if I have any more of that, they're going to boo me off stage. Then exercises like that and kickbacks and things like that, where you can be specific, that's where your lunch money is going to get earned, right? Because you're in this like unique situation where you need the hypertrophy to be very, very targeted, right? Or if you're doing it for some sort of metabolic goal or whatever, then short position exercises can be good, right? So the answer is no, but also the only reason to do an exercise isn't because it's the single biggest bang for your buck hypertrophy thing ever. There will be times when you use the second, third, fourth, 10th best exercise because it happens to suit this other purpose or part of the goal.
I get what you're saying. I guess that for me, it's a question of like, just because it's specific doesn't mean it's going to grow it. You know what I mean? I feel like short exercises are they're like feel versus real. You know what I mean? Like you feel them, but are they really doing anything is kind of the question. And so I get what you're saying. Like it might, on a set by set, we might just need more sets of it and they're probably not going to fatigue you that much. It's like, but is it even doing anything is kind of
do you do lying leg curls?
I alter the setup so that I get a nasty stretch in the hamstring. Mainly because I have never found a seated leg curl that I like. They just feel like shit for me. I understand that the seated leg curl is a better lengthened position, but I put pads under my hips when I do lying leg curls so that I basically turn myself into a prone seated leg curl.
You get 90 degrees of hip flexion in a lying leg curl?
Fully, but I try to turn myself into as much of a human taco shell
right.
as I can.
You did good mornings, right? Like I saw the post. You
Yeah.
talked about good mornings, right? Do you get anywhere close to the hamstring length in the lying leg curl that you're doing than you do the good morning?
I feel like I do with those. Like if I can rig the piece of equipment up enough, like because some of them are pretty slanted
right.
to be. And then
I'm gonna have you try and show me this when you come here on our leg curl.
I like kind of wish that seated hamstring curls felt better for me, but they always just feel like shit. Like I just haven't found a seated hamstring curl machine that I like. I feel like it just cuts the motion off too soon. Like,
so we have special modifications to some of ours that even if I can ever get Mike out here, like he'll really appreciate the things we have for more lengthened, right? But the research that does exist, right? The short exercises, when they're looking at these, are not producing no hypertrophy by any means, right? Even in the experienced lifters, they're producing hypertrophy. And in many cases, right? So there's the extreme cases that we have on a few of these where it's like, okay, it's 1.5x or whatever, like that tricep study that we just had. I can't remember. It was the one that Schoenfeld, posted whatever, where there was like long head was like 1.5x more, and the lateral and medial were 1.4x more in the overhead position than they were, down below or whatnot. But you look at like the leg extension study, right? And in that short position leg extension, just the short and partial, that was still a significant amount of hypertrophy. And when you look at the mixed version, it actually was more hypertrophy to do the lengthened partial and the short partial than it was to do the full range of motion, right? And in some of the divisions, it was actually more than in. So, I don't think that like we know everything in terms of muscle length. And I think part of that is that, there's multiple factors that go into this, because there's the mechanical leverage, the internal moment arms, there's, the specificity of the joint angle. And then there's like, is it really equal volume and fatigue and all of those things like that. So, I'm not going to just be like, well, all right, I'm only going to do lengthen exercises ever. And I don't think it's like they're only feel-based exercise. There definitely is a better or a different sensation of a fully shortened muscle versus a stretched muscle, but you get the greatest sensation at both extremes. The mid-range is where you're like, I don't know, hardest to feel tension, right? So
my question that I have with the lengthened position is, I think we may be witnessing people having avoided that part of the exercise, and it's almost like newbie gains because they haven't actually ever done it before. Mm-hmm. That's the main area that I'm currently kind of calling into question, quite honestly, because it's like I've watched enough people work out, even advanced people, and they just shortchange it. You know what I mean? Like people usually do a lousy job with actually going into full range of motion. So it's like untrained tissues in my mind that we're potentially hitting with these studies that are starting to look at these lengthened positions. Now I could be wrong, but that's a guess that I have with that.
Yeah. So an important caveat too is that none of these studies are actually testing the fully lengthened position. So all the research that we're quoting is towards the lengthened end, right? But I have a modified leg extension, and I still can't quite get to full knee flexion. So that means that that leg extension study is not really full, and most of the squat studies are not. You and I would probably go there and be like, this isn't full knee flexion. For them, it was like, okay, this is whatever, it's 60 degrees in knee, whatever the head, right? Yeah. But we'd be like, no, there's more there, right? So there's that's one of the things about some of the stuff that we're working on. Like the reason I invested in, the lab is I knew that like a lot of the critiques would be like, oh, there's nothing, this or whatever. It's like, there's no research on a pull around or a press around. There's not even research on a heel elevated full depth squat, right? There's, so we're trying to fill in as much tangible data on top of the biomechanics and stuff, as possible or whatnot. But that's an important thing when we look at the lengthened research, because I was having this discussion with Mike on the hack squat of like, well, does the hack squat have to be absolutely hardest at the most bottom degree, right? Or does it just need to be the bottom 3/4? Like, when does this benefit start? And what's the point of diminishing returns, of how much benefit you're getting from the stretch versus the extra fatigue that comes with it or whatnot, right? I mean, to think that we really know solidly exactly what to do with this information, I think is hubris at this point, right?
Yeah. And I look, I'm a pretty skeptical person, and I try not to let myself run wild with anything, because I've done that in the past. I've sort of like I've totally gotten exposed to something new that I think is the end all be all, and I'm like, oh my God, my savior, let me bow down. And but it's kind of like, I guess what I was saying before is, yeah, I do think that there's a lot of different ways to get to Rome. And I think that's kind of the cool part of hypertrophy. But it, like, I do, as far as time goes, I'm sure we have to wrap this up at some point. But I do have that question of like, how do you explain like all of the people that have achieved, like, I'm sure you've watched like huge dudes that have terrible form and questionable methodology, and of course the steroids, this, that, and the other thing. But there's lots of people that have done steroids. There's lots of people that have done, but there's so many people that have been successful. Like, I look at like Ronnie Coleman training videos and like
Mhm.
the worst equipment in the history of the world at Metroflex. Like the shoulder machine that he was using there is like, who made this thing? Like, this thing's crazy. But how, like, where does your mind go when you have to think about all of the examples of like moronic meat monkeys that have had incredible success with, pretty, like, just almost seemingly random methodologies that they followed?
So if you guys come for the third day, I will cover the part from our practical that we call the principle of thresholds. And so the way that I look at it is you have all of these variables that go into this, and you have to reach a certain threshold of all of them. Or because if you have a goose egg anywhere, then the whole equation is like multiplied by zero, zero, right? So you pick the best exercise, no effort, zero, doesn't matter, right? You have all the effort, but the exercise doesn't even train the muscle you want, zero, right? You're training hard, you're eating whatever, not sleeping at all, zero, right? So I look at it as like, look, there's a threshold for how good your exercise selection needs to be for your goal. There's a threshold for how much volume you need to stimulate with that, right? And how much effort needs to go in it. They kind of like, those are kind of compounding things, right? Like the more effort per set, the more volume or whatever. Don't want to overly complicate the example
Mm-hmm.
here, right? But we basically have like, all right, quantity, quality, exercise selection, technique. Like you look at all those things, right? And then of course, then comes like then the recovery factors or whatever, right? We break it down in a little bit more detail than this, but that's how I look at it. Is like, look, once you get over the threshold, you can choose to push any of those buttons harder to try and bring up the equation, right? Meaning that, like, okay, if you're doing a good enough exercise, you could choose to work really hard. You could choose to try and do more volume, right? Or it could be like, look, you could find a little bit better exercise, and that might target the tissue you want a little bit more. Like, all of those are ways of getting to more hypertrophy, right? And that's the thing about hypertrophy is it's like, well, we look at all these guys and we're like, well, all these guys put on a lot of muscle, but they don't all look exactly the same either. I mean, there's a huge genetic factor and component of that too. But some guys, naturally you look at how them grow, and some guys are like, well, this guy, developed this better than this guy or whatever here, whatnot. And part of that's genetics, part of it's going to be exercise selection. Maybe some of it's like some guy like pusses out on one exercise, and another guy that's his favorite thing to be a masochist about, et cetera. So there's all of these things. So the way I rationalize this is like, look, once you get over a bunch of threshold, because even if we're like, man, look, these exercises were trash. Like you look at some of the stuff Ronnie was doing, but I'm like, okay, it's trash with 800 pounds. So
Yeah.
that's a lot of fucking trash, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's still going to do something, especially with, amazing genetics and anabolics, I don't know how many. I mean, you've worked with a bunch of freaky athletes. I don't know how many in the bodybuilding space you worked with, but I worked with a ton of physique competitors, and the amount of guys that the guys that have the absolute best physiques have the best genetics because they're the guys that actually have to put their body through the least amount of hell to get that look. So it's like their symmetry and everything is like, and I'm like, but these are the guys actually that like do the least amount of effort and training. And you see this, and it's kind of disheartening, as somebody that loves training to think like, oh, they actually, some of these guys that like train really, really hard, they grow muscle, but it's not as pretty as the guy that like, he can look at it, whatever. And the other thing is that you'll notice like these guys with the great genetics grow muscles that they don't train, right? Like so they're just adjacent. I'm not talking about like, well, it's a synergist. And I'm like, no, they just like literally don't do that, right? Like, I mean, opening their car door and that's as much stimulus as they ever put into that thing, and it's bigger than this guy over here that's been training it for freaking 10 years, right? So that just goes to show that like, man, there are so many ways to go about this. You could have great genetics. You could use drugs. You could use a shitload of volume. You could train, really, really hard, right? You could have the best exercise in the world, but you need to have a certain amount of all of those things to earn the right to try and excel in any of them. And that's the message that I try and get across. Like, look, if you want to be really nuanced in your exercise selection, there's a certain threshold of effort and volume that you have to do to deserve to even care about those things, right? Just like there's a certain amount that you have to input into lifestyle and recovery if you want to, try and train yourself, into a hole. Like you can't abuse your body and not give it anything to recover from. I mean, hypertrophy is the sport of over recovery, right? If you don't recover more than the stress that you put on it, then you don't hypertrophy, you wither away. So that's how I explain it. It's like, look, there's multiple ways to get here, right? Now, when I'm thinking of like, you could choose your own battle. If you're a person that loves volume, you could go that route. If you're a person that loves effort, you could do, fewer sets, but all of those sets are balls to the wall. Probably, both of those people can make reasonable, results there, right? If you're a person that loves tinkering around with exercise, as long as you put enough volume and effort into it, you can go that route. And what I try and preach is when we're covering this is like, look, what you should be finding for your people is the least adverse way for them to bring up all of those areas. Right? Find the way for them to get better results that's the easiest for them, right? So if there's a better machine standing next to the one you're using, use the better machine, right? If you can't get this person, if this person, the person that quits fucking, 3 reps early every set, guess what? More sets, right? Or you got to find a way to motivate them to get those other 3 reps, right? But somehow you got to find a way to move the needle, right? And I just think that like once you reach a threshold, there's multiple ways that you can do it. And there's pros and cons to all of them. And that'll vary, by the individual.
Right. I mean, I really like this. What do you call it? The principle of thresholds.
Yes.
I I like that. That's a very nice visual as well. I can just kind of picture this in a lot of ways. I've always, I look at things sometimes and sometimes I'm like, we are all destined to be more muscular, less muscular versions of ourselves, more fat or less fat versions of ourselves. Like oftentimes I feel like we're so trying to combat nature, and it's just like you're going to always be you. Like if I had a Saint Bernard and a greyhound, and I was like, I'm pretty sure I can make the Saint Bernard look more like the greyhound if I bias its exercises in this particular direction. People would always kind of like, think that that's foolish. But with humans, we're I think we're like of this belief that we can really, drive the shape, the morphology into other directions. And I always wonder if that's possible or not. Like, how much can we ever influence that through the specific exercise choices? I think in my mind that threshold concept that you're talking about for being able to, I guess the word of the day is bias, but bias the stress towards specific regions of a muscle or anything like that. I wonder about that threshold. You know what I mean? Because I feel as though as long as you're like, it's such a big threshold. You know what I mean? Like the possibility, and then having a better exercise probably is such a diminishing return in my mind. Like that's I think that's where I probably have my greatest questions about this area that we're talking about.
This is why this weekend's going to be so good, because a lot of the stuff that we're doing, most people have never experienced it before, because a lot of these positions or whatnot, they're just not things that you would do. Like there are very few instances in life where you are going to fully lengthen the tissue voluntarily. Like if you're not specific, like all of our base motor patterns, like gait is like keep me in mid range at every joint possible. That's essentially like that's where like our body doesn't want to go to the point where a tissue is closest to its strain, right? So it'll be very interesting. Like this is one of those things where it's like, man, if I could just grab people and pull them here, right? The conversation drastically changes after you can physically go through and experience this, because that's where then you can, as much as I kind of rag on like sensation not being the most accurate thing, but at least all of a sudden you can start to conceptualize like, man, that was a very specific stretch, right? Or that was a very specific contraction, especially if you're more body aware, right? And that's why I've invested in the technology, and I'm hoping to have, Evan Picon's his Ninex, the new device that's coming out, like the sequel to the Moxie type thing that measures nitric oxide as well as oxygenation and whatnot, right? I'm hoping to have those there, though, and I'll have just probably have gotten them by the time we have the seminar. So maybe we can, like, if you're open to it, we can go total universal soldier on you and put all the things on you if you want to, right? That's like one of the reasons I got the lab.
The necklace with the ears on it.
Yeah, we can get you one of those, right?
So yeah, and I understand what you're saying, because I feel as though with my system, in particular, when we start getting into other planes and really teaching people what turning is and what lateralizing is, if you just try to watch that on a virtual thing, you never get. You know what I mean? And that is one of the reasons why I'm such a big believer in continuing to push in-person hands-on learning experiences. It's not the easiest thing to do these days, but I just think that we've shifted way too far towards virtual space stuff. And without that in-person, face-to-face, working with people, feeling it, doing it, you're never going to be able to really learn something or reach your full potential within this industry as a coach or practitioner or anything.
Yeah, I think it's extremely ignorant for people to think that they can learn movement not moving. Right? I think, it's a blessing and a curse, the fact that we are able to reach people so much easier now with information. But, when it comes to physical movement, when it comes to actually learning about how to push people or to be pushed and whatnot, like, you can't learn RAR like watching other people train hard, right? On YouTube or whatever, right? You can't learn what failure is. You can't, and a lot of people like I think, if you haven't ever experienced something like this, and this is what I think is just a travesty in the personal training world, right? Is that so many of these people that they come out of school or they get certificates or whatever, but they get like almost no actual hands-on education before they actually work with humans, right? And then there's just a deer in the headlights, right? Like I used to be a corporate manager at one point in time for, a bunch of trainers across a bunch of gyms. And that was the biggest thing. Like, new trainers come out and they might have like 16 more letters behind their name than somebody else and just have no idea how to work with people. And if you're talking about for yourself, like if you come to Pat's seminar, you come to an N1 seminar and you get this hands-on stuff, that's not something like what you write something down and you forget about it. Like, this stuff sticks with you, right? It's not muscle memory, it's memory that, like, these are experiences that, like, I can't put a price on it, because like the stuff that I did when I was like, I did Poliquin seminars and whatnot, but like those hands-on seminars, that was the stuff that stuck with me, right? All the medical things and physiology things and whatever, it's like I took bits and pieces away from those, but I would say the thing that like really guides me, like in terms of working with real athletes and teaching coaches, is a lot more. It's like, man, even if there was a big part of theory with the hands-on, there's just something about actually having that hands-on element that drives home, the theory. So I'm going to cut it off here, guys, but that's my spiel for trying to get you guys to, hey, it doesn't have to be our stuff, but like, man, just go out there and do something in person where you actually get to put yourself through the meat grinder. Pat, anything that you want to close off, or anything else that you want to let people know is going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on a lot of topics here. I've always had really good conversations with you. I appreciate the thought that you put into things. I always, you know, I will never stop myself from trying to just put my thoughts out there. And again, like, I hope that nobody else does that either. You know what I mean? Like, I think people nowadays are just so afraid of saying something because of, I don't know, the ramifications. Like if you believe something and you don't say it because you're afraid of the consequences, I think that's cowardice. You know what I mean? And nothing happens. And look, like I'll continue. Like I have a tremendous amount of respect for you, and when we have conversations, I always leave having learned something, and I always leave with being able to kind of think about things differently or question things in a new manner. And I think that that's like, for me, one of the greatest gifts that I ever get. You know, I'm a cognitive person, and when I have new systems running in my head cognitively, it's fuel for me. That's like what I live off of. So, you know, I hope that, I mean, I don't even mind it when people run wild with things that are like quick hitters on social media or something like that. People will always do that. That's the nature of the beast. But I do hope that the same people that get carried away with the emotional responses to the quick hitters on social media also come for the long form and the real discussion and that stuff, because I think that what they'll see is that we'll have the ability to express ourselves, our viewpoints, our foundational knowledge pieces that back up the way that we think. And there may be points at which we ultimately don't agree, but there's probably always going to be a sense of understanding where the other person is coming from and appreciation of that other person's capabilities and competency.
Yeah. Well, the enjoyment is mutual, Pat, and I'm very much looking forward to the end of March there, right? I think this is going to be a lot of fun, right? And like I said, I encourage you guys that are interested in this stuff, you know, get hands on, and there won't be a better time than Colorado, the end of March, right? So hopefully we'll see you guys there. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.